Alrighty, it is November the 2nd, 2024. This is projection number 12. We are only 3 days away from the U.S. presidential election. And if you've been following me on this channel, you understand we're not using polling to project who we believe will win the presidential election. Instead, we're using real data that does include historical trends from the 2020 election and even prior to that, in addition to actual votes cast up to now. We're using the NBC News Decision 2024 website. You can see so far there have been over 72 million votes cast by mail-in or early in-person nationally. And this particular map allows you to go to each of the states and see how many votes have been cast. It also allows you a snapshot of what was the party registration. For example, in the state of Georgia, of the 4 million votes cast thus far, 45% have come from registered Democrats and 48% from registered Republicans, and the remaining are independent or other. Now, in order to make our projections, there are a number of things we have to presume. The first being that everyone registered Democrat is voting for Kamala Harris, and everyone voting for Republican is voting for Donald Trump. And then the remaining other or independent is split according to or basically mirroring what happened in 2020 election. And we're using or taking that data from CNN Politics exit polls taken. For example, in the state of Georgia, you can see that going down to ID party, under independent, 53% voted for Biden, where 44% voted for Trump. We're going to presume that is how it's also going to happen. Now, there is polling that does suggest Kamala Harris is doing somewhat better than Biden has done up to now in terms of the independent vote. But we're going to presume that when it's all said and done, because Republicans tend to, since 2016, more likely to vote later or in person on election day than by mail or in person early, because Donald Trump has been suggesting mail-in vote is not to be trusted. However, in the 2024 election, he's been pushing to vote early, more so than he has in the past. So that's why I suspect that even though polling is suggesting Kamala Harris is doing better than where Biden did in 2020, I'm still going to go with the Biden numbers because of those two reasons that I just pointed out. Now, also, we're going to take into account how many Republicans voted for the Democrat in 2020 and how many Democrats voted for the Republican. I've taken all of that various data and placed it onto a spreadsheet. And what we're seeing here, basically, I'm just going to go over this fairly rapidly. You can see in the first segment here, each of the states that are considered battleground: Texas, Florida, Iowa, Georgia, Arizona, North Carolina, Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. This is the registration data from 2020 in each of these states. In this first column, you see what percentage of those that were registered to vote in 2020 actually showed up in that state. For example, in Texas, 60% showed up to vote. Of that 60%, 63% of registered Democrats voted in that election, and 75% of registered GOP showed up to vote in that election, and 63% independents showed up to vote in that election. You can also see here registered Democrats and registered GOP, registered independent. It just tells you the number, and if you divide that number into this number, you get the percentage. And then finally, you add all those up to get a total that voted in the 2020 election in that state. And you can see in Texas, well over 11 million folks voted. And this, you see off to the right, is the number of folks that were registered to vote. And then finally, here you can see a total number that voted in the battleground states in 2020. Now, the next section right below that is the data I'm taking from the early voting. And in Texas, you can see here over all the way over to the right in the pink is so far nearly 8.6 million votes have been cast. That's 76% of the vote that was cast in 2020. That is a very good showing. The early voting, I think, was more close to 60-something%. So we're ahead of schedule here in the state of Texas. And that you can divide that number of 11 million into the 8.5 million to get your 76%. When you add all these states up, so far there have been over 33 million votes cast in the battleground states, which is 60% of the vote that we have received in the entire election of 2020. So if we go by that, we're expecting about a 40% remaining vote left over between now and the ending of the election. Although so far we're ahead of schedule in a number of the states. And we'll get to that in just a second. But you can see that under this first column you have Dem, then GOP, Independent, and then basically you take that vote and that website shows you again what percentage Dems voted, GOP, and finally Independent, and then that gives you a rough guesstimate of how many votes were cast for that from that party. And remember, again, we're assuming that the Dems vote exclusively for Harris as our baseline, and GOP exclusively votes for Trump for our baseline. And then the Independent split, mirroring what happened in 2020. And we also then look at what happened, how many GOP went over to Dem, and how many Dem went over to GOP in 2020. And we mirror that after all of our numbers are added up. And that's what this next line is. We get a multiplier based upon what percentage of Dems have showed up so far. You can see in the state of Texas, as our example, 74% of those that showed up in 2020 have showed up in 2024 thus far. What percentage of 2020 showed up among Dems? And so we're just going to say that 100% of what showed up in 2020 is going to be shown up in 2024. Thus, 26% of Dems in Texas are yet to still show up. But given that this number is higher, we're ahead of schedule, it may be more than 100%. But we're just going to go with it just being 100% of what showed up in 2020. And then we divide this number by the number that already showed up to get what's called a multiplier. And we use that multiplier to multiply it by the number that showed up for the remaining projected same-day votes on Election Day. Then we add these two together to get what we're projecting to be the total votes before we take into account the independent vote and the crossing over of GOP to Dem and Dem to GOP. And we do that for the GOP as well and the independents. Then, after we've gotten all of our multipliers, we multiply those into, we add those numbers and we split them accordingly. You can see here in the state of Texas, independents voted 51% toward the Dem candidate and 45% voted toward the GOP candidate. So that means that on average across the battleground states, there was an 8% favor of Biden over Trump among independents. And so that's what we're just assuming. And then from GOP going over to Dem, about 6% did so. And among Dems going to GOP, about 5% did so. And that's really only a difference of about 1%. So we're just going to kind of assume that same thing, even though it does appear, at least from the media, there's a larger number of GOP than was in 2020 that are suggesting that they're crossing over. But we just don't know that at this point. And last thing I want to add is, if we're going to think about polling at all, there is one that's just been released, and that's the Des Moines Seltzer poll that is so far rated as the most accurate poll in the nation, and it has Harris 3 percentage points over Donald Trump, which is very significant. In 2020, it had Donald Trump 7 points ahead of Biden, and I think Trump ended up winning Iowa by about 8%. So they were off maybe by 1%. So even if they're off by 1%, at least as I was suggesting, that Harris is going to end up winning Iowa by 2%. And then it also tells us kind of that Harris, if she's doing so well in Iowa, where else is she doing well nationally? Okay, so just bear that in mind. May or may not mean anything. They may just get it wrong this time, or they may continue their trend of being the most accurate poll in the nation. But again, this particular model is not taking into account those polling. But I mentioned that because there was about 3 days ago, I think it was projection number 8. People were very surprised to find that our model projected that Harris was going to win Iowa by 1%. Then a new batch of votes came in, and Trump took over again by roughly, I think, about 3 or 4%. But actually, he went ahead by about 4 to 5%, and that's more indicative of where we would expect him to be. But even that would be a slightly less of a showing, where he had 8% in 2020. Now, using that model, let's go ahead and go through each of the states. And what I'm going to do, and that's what this last part is, one last thing. Polling suggests about 60% of Democrats will show up early, and about 47% of GOP will show up early. So basically, I'm just rounding it to 60 and 50, and about 55% of independents. We're going to take that into account to break a tie, if we really close, if there's a state that's tied. But let's go ahead and black out all of the other states so that we're not distracted by them. And let's start with our first state on this list. And using our model, currently the state of Texas, there have been roughly, as I said, about 8.6 million votes cast, and over 50% of those have been cast by GOP. When it's all said and done, we're expecting GOP to pick about 54% of the vote, and Harris pick up about 46%. And that's just votes going between Trump and Harris, not including independent votes and others. But we're just presuming, we're only focusing on that 100% that are going to go to Harris and Trump. When it's all said, it might look more like 52 to say 47 or something like that. And again, you can see the difference here being that there was quite more votes for Trump or from the GOP than from the Dems. Nearly 4.4 million, whereas for Dems it's 3.2 million. So that's 1.2 million votes by the GOP party than from Dems so far. And that's why, even though the independents are favoring Harris by 6% over Trump, it's still not enough to make up the difference. And also you can see that roughly 5% of Dems or GOP is going to go over to Harris versus 4% of the GOP will go over to Dems will go over to Trump. And so that's on a spread of only roughly 1% anyway. But even with that, I think Trump is very comfortably taking Texas as it stands right now. So that brings the Electoral College up to 226 compared to Trump's 183. And then let's go on, move to the next state in the lineup, and that's Florida. And people were really surprised to find, using this model, that Harris is winning. Now, yesterday she was ahead by a good 6.6%, but a new batch of votes have come in that have helped Trump start to catch up. So now it's only a difference of 0.2%. But right now she's slightly favored to win Florida, but that could change between now and the end of Election Day. But this is presuming if election were held tomorrow. But of course it's not. It's being held on Tuesday. But as it stands, that would mean, using this model, 256 for Harris versus 183 for Donald Trump. All right. And again, Trump is catching up. Let's go on, move on to the state of Iowa and see if Trump is still holding on despite the Seltzer poll. According to our model, yesterday there was a spread of about, I said, roughly 5%. That has been narrowed down now to about 3%. It still favors Trump, but it's moving toward Harris's favor. But that 3% spread is, it's still quite significant. And again, it's mainly because in the state of Iowa, there's been more votes from the GOP than from the Dems. And that has helped Trump to move ahead. So as it stands right now, Trump is taking Iowa, 189 to Harris's 256. Moving along to our next state in the lineup, and that's the state of Georgia, another very contentious state. And at one point in our prediction of using this model, Trump was ahead by roughly 3.5, 4 points. But now it's been narrowed down to, looks like what, 3.6%. So roughly about 1% Harris has shaved off over the past 3 or 4 days. So I'm not really sure there's enough time for her to catch up, but the big difference here is in Georgia, you can see that there's been a lot more Republicans showing up by almost 125,000 compared to the Democrats. And the way she's going to win that state is if we get quite a bit more Republicans coming over or a lot more independents show up. So far, those registered as independent, roughly, looks like in the state of Georgia, roughly 65%, 66% have shown up compared to 2020's number. So expecting another 34% on election day. So that's not going to be enough to favor Harris as it stands right now. But right now, everything is trending toward Harris. It's just a question of if there's going to be enough time for her to pass Trump in the states of Iowa and Georgia. In Texas, I think it's pretty much out of reach as it stands right now. All right, moving on to our next state in the lineup, and that's the state of Arizona. Now, yesterday, Harris was barely winning. I think it's by 0.2%. But now, with the new batch of votes, Trump is taken back over. So the state of Arizona is going over to Trump. So 200 to 256 using this model. And it's just really a question of how much of the independent vote is going to be voting for Harris, because if she can't get a larger portion of independent vote, then she's not going to be able to win Arizona. But you can see that there's a difference of almost 200,000 votes in favor of Trump in the state of Arizona as it stands right now. Okay, moving on to our next state, and that's the state of North Carolina, another contentious state. That's been flipping back and forth between Trump and Harris. And actually yesterday, or the last projection I had, Harris was ahead by about 0.6. Now she's ahead by about 0.4. So she's lost a little bit of ground, but she still is ahead here by 0.4. So it's very close in North Carolina. So it still really could go either way. That's so close. But using our model, that's enough to put her over the line and make her the next president and the first female president of the United States. 272 to Trump's 200. All right, this is as it stands today, 3 days from the election, and using this particular model. Now, again, things may not go as well for her as it did for Biden. And we're going to sort of factor that at the end of this exercise to kind of shift things over a little bit in Trump's favor to see if that would change the outcome. All right, now we're going into the last remaining states, and the next one on the lineup is Nevada. And Nevada is just shifting ever so slightly each day toward the Democrats. And it's comfortably one of the more comfortable states, actually. We're projecting 51.8% of the vote compared to 48.2% of the vote. So that's a difference of 3.6%. And a lot of this is becoming clearer because it's a 6% spread of the independents favoring Harris. And actually polling suggests that it's a good 10% spread among independents. So we're even being favorable toward Trump here. But right now, the number of votes out in Nevada is only a 24,000 vote spread between GOP and Democrats favoring Trump right now, or GOP. But how much of that of the GP is going over to Harris? If it goes by 2020 model, then we would see that roughly 5% of the GOP will go to Dems, and roughly 5% of Dems will go over to Trump. So it's pretty much a washout. So what's really making the difference here is that 6% of independents that are shifting over to Harris. And that independent vote is quite large compared to the other Dem and GOP in Nevada. You can see that almost 300,000 votes, which is pretty close to the other parties. And so that's quite a large group, and that really is making a difference for Harris there. All right, now we're going into the blue wall, or the Midwestern states, and the first one is Wisconsin. Now, the spread was very significant yesterday. I think it was something like 5 to 6% favoring Trump, but Harris has narrowed down to 1.4% now because of the new batch of votes. And again, you can see there's a spread of 12% among independents. A huge swath of the votes in Wisconsin are coming from independents, 41% of them. And you can see that 12% difference favoring toward Harris is really helping her to start catch up. All right, so the state of Nevada goes over to Harris, so let's give her those 6, and the state of Wisconsin does as well, bringing the total now to 288 to Trump's 200. Down to our last 2 states, looking at the state of Michigan, and this is where Trump is catching up. Yesterday it was, I think, something like a 0.5% spread. Now it's down to 0.2. But as it stands right now, Harris is taking Michigan. And that may change by tomorrow. 303 for Harris and 200 for Donald Trump. And now I forgot to put in Georgia, which is for Donald Trump, so I apologize. So actually he's at 216 to Harris's 303. And we're down to our last state, and that's the state that is probably the one that's on everybody's mind, and that's the state of Pennsylvania. But as it stands right now, Harris has a 1.2% lead over Trump, and that's been narrowed down to something like 2.4% lead in our last projection. So what's the takeaway here is, using this particular model, a couple of things. First, Harris gets 323 to Donald Trump's 216. That's the first one, winning the election. Some surprises, her taking Florida and North Carolina. She loses Georgia and Arizona compared to Biden. And the other thing that we see here is that, what was I going to point out, is the independents are what's really making a difference here. All right, now let's presume that Harris does a little bit more poorly among the independents. And let's take off, let's say 3%, and give them to Donald Trump in each one of these battleground states. So I'm going to change this, and starting with Texas, where it's 51% in 2020 toward Dems, and I'm going to make it 47%. We're going to just do that all the way down here. 51, 47, 50, 50, 47, 47, 51, 48, and then finally 49. And then we're going to give that 3% of independents over to Donald Trump. And we'll see kind of what ends up happening here. Alrighty, we're here. 47, 49, 47, 45, 48, and then finally 47. And with that, you can see that Harris only has Nevada and Pennsylvania. That means Donald Trump would win. So we would take off North Carolina, give it to Donald Trump. We'd also give Florida to Donald Trump. We would also give Wisconsin and Michigan to Donald Trump. And if this were the case, if Donald Trump performs much better with the independents than he did against Biden in 2020, then he would win 287 to Harris's 251. Now, whether or not you believe that's the case is up to you, but That's where it stands today. But again, that's not what our model suggests. Using our model, if we're going by what happened in 2020, then we would say that Harris is going to take Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina, and barely hold on to Florida as it stands today at 322 to 216. Now, with the trends, it's probably, unless the trends change, it looks like Trump would pick up Florida. He may also pick up North Carolina because they're trending toward him. Now, these states here also is trending toward Trump. Pennsylvania and Michigan. Wisconsin, however, is trending toward Harris. Nevada is trending toward Harris. Arizona is trending toward Harris. So let's say that eventually Arizona switches over to Harris. Wisconsin comfortably goes into Harris's lane. But Michigan and Pennsylvania do shift over to Donald Trump. Then he would win 285 to Harris's 253. But again, as I said, right now, as it stands today, Harris is expected to win using this model with 322 electoral votes to Donald Trump's 216. We'll do a more coming up, probably at least anywhere from 2 to 3 additional projections before we do our final one sometime on election day, probably about the end of that evening or something like that. But this is where it stands. And if you like this model and you want to see how things happen between now and election day, be sure to thumbs up and subscribe and hit that notification bell. Good day.